So we're talking about trade. Now, I don't know about you, but as an economist, I've found I don't entirely agree with President Trump's economic theory of trade. But I think his political theory of trade is maybe a little closer to the mark. And the global trading system that he's sort of gone to war with, or at least had a rhetorical war with over the last couple of years, I think we all know, and many people in the audience know, it has a lot of flaws, and it certainly has a diminishing number of fans, or so it often seems. So I think it's important when we're thinking ahead and thinking of the future landscape and how to make things better, we have to recognize some of the areas that have been problems and that are problems and challenges for the multilateral, rule-based system that many of us grew up to think was the best approach to global trade and that we heard a little bit about this morning. So very quickly, 3, I think, are the big challenges. China. In some ways, China marks the crowning achievement of the multilateral trading system. If you look at China's entry to the global economy, the global trading system, over the last 20 years, what that's achieved. But it's also presented enormous challenges. Its sheer scale, the sheer size of its labor force, has caused adjustments and challenges which I think are only now being properly recognized and understood. Maybe more than 2 million manufacturing jobs in the US displaced by Chinese competition alone, we're now estimating. And its top-down, ambitious, single-minded approach to economic development, I think has not followed the playbook, shall we say, that many people had written for China when it entered the WTO. That presents challenges. It will continue to present challenges if you look at the kind of ambitious targets that China has for the China 2025 agenda. So China is something the multilateral system has not always dealt with well, although in many ways it's also been its achievement. Technology, I think, is now changing the economic landscape for trade in a way that will present challenges. You've had ever more sophisticated global supply chains developing in the sort of first couple of decades of globalization. But then technology is now changing the argument for those supply chains. I think the days of the SpongeBob SquarePants birthday cake, baked in the UK, sold in the UK, but packaged in China, are over. Those days did exist. You knew that those cakes had been packaged in China because they were in boxes and they were eat by 2027. A lot of those supply chains within manufacturing are being unwound, but we're also seeing technology expand the number of service sector industries that can be traded. And I was struck, the research that Bloomberg Economics, my economists at Bloomberg Economics did, was in your package for the forum. One of the key facts in there is that all of the growth in the global labor force in the next 20 years is going to be in skilled work, not unskilled. And most of that in emerging market economies. Not sure the multilateral trading system has so far shown it can cope with those growing service sector industries. And finally, obviously, there's a political challenge. Coming out of all that, we may have had, albeit grudging, political support for free trade over these last couple of decades. That's clearly not there now. It certainly can't be relied upon, and there's big challenges coming. So we're going to fix all that in the next 30 minutes or so. And we have, with MasterCard and FedEx, we have 2 of the titans of those global services industries, but we also have the practitioners of global trade here. Ailish, I'm going to put you on the spot, because you said to me when we were meeting earlier, I come from the future. I come to tell you that things are not so bad. Sure. If we're thinking about saving the WTO or saving the global trading system, is that the right way to put it? Where do we start? Where do you think is the best way forward?
Sure. Well, we were joking in the green room. I was saying, I'm here from the future to tell you that absolutely there is a better way forward, and a deal can be done, and many deals will get done. Our experience in Canada, negotiating the USMCA, the trade agreement formerly known as NAFTA, tells me one critical message for the business audience that is here, and that is, there's an incredible amount of volatility in politics, just as there has been in the markets, but keep your eye on the trend line. And the trend line is, at the end of the day, that we did a very effective deal with the United States. And I do believe that there are deals to be done for the benefit of the multilateral trading system as well. So my second piece of advice is that all of us, business and political leaders, have to recommit to the multilateral trading system. I won't go so far as to say I don't agree with the argument that some have put forward that people are and nations have been free riders, but I think we've been complacent. And so I would really call on everyone in this room, and I was very buoyed by the conversations this morning from the Chinese leadership and from the Import-Export Expo by President Xi, that China will recommit and become incredibly engaged. And we will need all actors to recommit. It's a governance renewal at the multilateral level and nothing less. And the last thing I just want to share, I think, which really resonated with me from your opening video that Michael Bloomberg presented to us this morning, is that we have to give people hope. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau always says one thing, and I'm a recovering trade negotiator myself. I'm very comfortable with data. I'm very comfortable in a negotiating room. And the Prime Minister is always demanding to us as his officials, make this real for people. Show me how this matters to entrepreneurs. Show me how this matters to inclusion, so that more small and medium-sized enterprises see themselves visibly, even if they're not the final exporter of record. They are exporters in the supply chain process as part of creating dynamic services which matter more and more to the final products. So my last message would be ladder down. We've pursued a lot of politics and policies over the last 20 years that I think have been about lifting the ladder and being quite, I think, perhaps content to think that market forces will take care of everything. Let's not leave trade alone. Let's recommit to inclusive growth. And for all of us, ask how you can put the ladder down in your organization to lift other people up and include them in what you're working on.
Okay, and I want to get, in a minute, one of the key goals of the panel is to think about how businesses can contribute to this agenda and certainly think more about inclusion. But just going to you, Peter Mandelson, Lord Mandelson, just on the trading system itself, is it possible? I mean, you have been a great friend of China and have worked closely on business ties with China. When the dust settles from all the battles and rhetoric from President Trump, is it possible that we will end up in a better place?
God, you're trying to be very optimistic here. Better place.
We've started off on this Canadian optimistic tone. Try hard.
Try hard. Look. As much as he would like to, and is boycotting the WTO and taking apart its sort of dispute settlement machinery by blocking the appointment of new judges to operate the dispute settlement machinery in the WTO, I wouldn't say that the WTO is doomed, not yet. But it is certainly at a very, very serious crossroads. That's true. It is drifting badly as an organization. It risks collapse, but it has not reached that point. And that's why it's so important to double down and recommit to the multilateral trade system, which the WTO embodies, supports, polices and runs to the best of its ability, because every free trade agreement that you make is frankly second best to a multilateral trade agreement in the benefits that it creates, the opening up of markets, but also the fairer distribution of the benefits from those markets will come much more effectively from a multilateral trade agreement with its sort of universal and global coverage than any free trade agreement would be able to do. But we have to face the reality about the trading system and the WTO. The first is that we are seeing a fraying consensus of public opinion, which has hitherto supported it. And that fraying consensus comes as a result of a loss of faith or loss of confidence amongst people in the benefits of trade liberalization. You know, they see globalization and the huge restructuring of global supply chains and the impact that is having on production and people's jobs and place, particularly, but not only in the West. We're seeing a process of deindustrialization in many, many countries, particularly advanced, developed countries, where the movement towards services and away from manufacturing is having a huge impact on the labor market. And of course, now we are seeing the emergence of AI and robotics, which in turn is having a third, tertiary impact on how people earn their living and the sorts of jobs they do. And people's fear is that the trade system, and they lay an enormous amount, wrongly in my view, at the foot of trade policy in the trade system. Mm-hmm. Their view is that this is a sort of, non-inclusive process, which, yes, is growing the global economic pie, and in that sense, economics is doing its job. But politics is failing to divide up that pie and to distribute the benefits in the way people expect. And that's why people are turning against trade, turning against globalization in the West. They just feel they're not getting their fair share of the pie early enough. And therefore, we've got to address not only, the sort of practical, physical operation of the international trading system, rebuild and replenish confidence in the WTO, and we can come back to how we do that, but we have a major political job, a major political challenge on our hands too. Politics has got to work much better if we're going to recreate what I describe is that fraying consensus amongst people in favor of trade liberalization.
Ajay Banga, we talk about how can businesses be more part of this agenda, but part of the political problem is that people feel businesses have been too much center frame when it comes to trade negotiations, that these deals have all been done. The ones that have been done, although it's been a long time since the WTO managed one, but the ones that have been done with multinational companies in mind and not people. How do things need to change to combat the perception? Because it's not entirely wrong perception.
Well, I think that most companies in the last 4 to 5 years and their leadership, through a series of things, not just trade, but the revolution in social media, the social issues people are facing, most companies are beginning to think about their role as being more than merely trying to figure out a way to advantage themselves through one agreement or another agreement. And I think it shows up in many different ways, and the public dialogue has yet to completely recognize that change in some ways. But I would tell you that if we don't participate as companies in driving against this issue of exclusion, that's the result that people attach to trade, even though I would say, as Peter said, technology actually could well have contributed to some of that exclusion. And it's therefore not just trade, but you've got to fight it. So what am I talking about? My view is that everything ranging from, if you look at a company like ours, everything ranging from our commitment to financial inclusion. We, 4 or 5 years ago, with the World Bank and the IMF said, we will reach 500 million people out of the 2 billion in the world who currently don't have a way to receive, send, or save money or get access to insurance. We will reach them by 2020. When I said it, I myself did not have a clear plan of action to get to 2020, and I had a few people in my company who thought that their master boss had gone nuts, which is probably correct. However, we've reached 360 million people as we're counting. And I think we can reach the 500 by 2020. So my view is working with governments, working with telecom companies, working with data companies, working with banks and merchants. We've found our way to make that happen. That's one example. I don't make much money out of it. I lose money, more or less, on every single individual who gets connected. But the fact is, if I can connect them to an electronic payment system of some type to receive money, to save money, to get insurance, I reduce the role of cash in the economy. And reducing the role of cash in the economy is in my best interest. So the trick here is to use private sector capital, ingenuity, technology in a way that allows us to do well in our company, what suits our company and our shareholders, but also do good at the same time. If you align those two interests, we can find a way to get the right public-private partnerships and private-private partnerships to take on what I think is a very large issue, the issue we're discussing. So that's one example. I can give you another example. With Unilever, we've got a whole effort in Kenya where we go to small merchants who basically are out of the financial system. But every week they buy product from Unilever. Unilever knows how much product that merchant is buying. And therefore, if you were to digitize that record and you ask them to start accepting payments through a phone or a fingerprint or an eyeball, whatever works sense for you, and you then get the input and output of that merchant digitized, you can use data to make credit scoring systems that make it much better for a bank to lend money to them. We've reached 20,000 merchants in the course of a few months. Their Unilever sales are up 20%. The banks are getting paid. The government's happy. We're happy. There are ways to do well and do good at the same time if leadership in companies is willing to recognize that our ingenuity and our capital can make a difference to the picture. That's kind of sets of examples that I'm trying to work my way through. Nothing that I'm saying takes away from the issues of the WTO or multilateral trade versus FTAs. We can talk about that as well, because I believe companies need to engage on that topic as much as we're engaging on this idea of doing well and doing good at the same time. We cannot operate in our little space. That space does not exist in its old parameters any longer. You have to go on both sides of that.
So, Fred Smith, I mean, Ajay's given us good examples of companies working and trying to support inclusion, particularly in the developing economies. But of course, you know, one of the things that's happened and Donald Trump has kind of put a spotlight on is the discontent in advanced economies like the US. And we're at risk of going to a system which is not about the least well-off anymore when it comes to trade. It's about single countries and the US, the law of the jungle, as was referred to yesterday. You know, how does FedEx, how does a big company try and combat that in a country like the US?
Well, of course, most of the people at the political level, including the president, are talking about things, you know, from a theoretical standpoint. We're down talking about them at the granular standpoint. As we sit here and talk, FedEx is moving millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of shipments around the world. So we're watching a plebiscite or a referendum every day on the economy. It's not something that, you know, we read about. So the president's views on trade are quite rare. He believes that trade deficits are a loss.
They're rare here. I'm not sure they are rare in the world.
Well, perhaps,
yeah.
but I think there's a general consensus among mainstream economists that open trade and zero subsidies and zero trade non-tariff barriers is a good thing. I mean, the United States of America became the rich country that it is for a very simple reason, the Commerce Clause. And so you could be having the same conversation in 1890 about textile mills leaving New Hampshire and Massachusetts and going to South Carolina. It's just the law let this Schumpeterian readjustment take place. So beginning in 1934 with Roosevelt and Cordell Hull, there was this general consensus that open markets, getting as close to zero tariffs, zero trade barriers, zero subsidies, like the Commerce Clause permitted in the United States, the UK obviously with the famous Corn Laws in the 19th century, and that was the general consensus. And so over the last 15 or 20 years, it's broken down first because of China's activities, and then Trump seizing on that, and 70,000 factories. You mentioned 2 million U.S. manufacturing jobs lost. 80% of the jobs lost in the United States have been lost because of technology, not because of trade. So I think the issue here are the benefits of global trade, which has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and which we're watching every day down at the individual level, will prevail, or whether the mercantilism and the nationalism and all of the things that are so much in the news will prevail. I'm an optimist. I think people have an innate desire to travel and trade. I think that these activities going on at the micro level overwhelm eventually the political resistance. And I think you'll see that in China. I think you'll see China become much more open. I was struck by Vice President Wang's comment today. I don't remember the exact term, but I'm paraphrasing him. It was something like the magic of the market. You remember the phrase I'm talking about? That's a pretty astounding statement from the Vice President of the socialist government. So I think there's a general consensus that markets are what should decide economic activity, and the rest is just a negotiation, whether it's multilateral or bilateral. And the real test is going to come up November the 20th down in Buenos Aires, whether President Xi and President Trump can make a transactional deal, or whether the ideology of some of Trump's advisors prevail.
Eilish.
Yeah.
I mean, this sort of represents what might have been the view, maybe some would say it was a complacent view to say that the overall support for free trade would prevail. Do you think we have to be a bit more
So I just want to say, I mean, it's a perfectly rational view, and it's one that I share. Let's just look at the numbers, though, of Americans who, when polled, do they support free trade? And that number has been going down, and it is less than 50%. How do we increase that number? I think there's a couple of really important issues that Canada has been working on, because we want to create, I like your point about the market efficiency piece, but we're also looking to create a sustainable society. The U.S. spends 1/5 of the average of advanced economies on retraining displaced workers. So yes, it may be that technology is responsible for the vast majority of that dislocation. That's not a good enough explanation. No matter what the explanation for the dislocation is, we can't leave people on the sidelines. Secondly, I would draw a direct correlation from the global financial crisis to the concerns with trade today. I mean, people lost the most important thing in advanced economies to many of their asset base and their future, and that was their house. And people want to know that there is a way back into a stable future for themselves and their families. And the last piece is education. We spend, I think, too little on early childhood education in the advanced economies, and I'll just speak of North America. But we should be looking, and education is, of course, a huge preoccupation for the Sustainable Development Goals and a lot of the work in developing economies. So, I mean, I think, of course, FedEx, I love your point. There's a referendum going on every day. But never underestimate, I think, people's ability to disassociate what they consume from what their politics is on trade. And we have to start talking about that in order, I think, to rediscover that kind of policy and engagement. And I really take your point. I think this is something that CEOs, one of the best things I recommend to CEOs, convene, if you will, a mutual mentoring group with your own employees. The men and women from the top to the bottom of your organization, invite them for breakfast at least twice a year. And if they're not convinced about your case for trade, then you still have work to do.
Stephanie, I think that we're sort of in danger of reaching a sort of consensus on this panel, in this sense, the single greatest achievement of progressive politics in the 20th century, certainly, thinking of my own country and Europe, was to build a society in which the individual risks created by market economics could be managed by social welfare and health insurance. That's essentially the great sort of policy achievement of the 20th century. And I think that what we've got to do now in the 21st century is basically we need to do the same for globalization, just as we did for the emergence of capitalism in the last century, to make its costs bearable for individuals and to share the benefits of globalization more transparently and more fairly across society. Now, I think that's a good starting point. I mean, in a sense, I would say that, wouldn't I? Because, you know, I'm a social democrat and that's where my politics are. But unless we approach policy making in that sense, I don't think we're going to be able to repair successfully that consensus we need in the world to underpin the process of trade, of open markets, and of globalization. We're not going to be able to sustain that sort of fleet of foot that we need unless we are going to manage better the impact of those adjustments on individuals.
But Peter, I want to let Fred back in a minute and Ajay, but if you looked at, you know, we heard from Fred a kind of a US, you might call a characteristically American way of viewing this and talking about Schumpeter and the fact that workers would inevitably move and cross borders and other things. But if you thought, you know, how are we going to have more inclusion? How are we going to have support that you've just talked about? How would you make the US, for example, more supportive of training workers? You would probably be talking about making it more like Europe. If you actually look at Europe, we tend to think Europe's quite good at having social partnerships, at having welfare systems and safety nets.
But there's another
for people.
problem.
And yet you look at the populism and the opposition to trade, it doesn't seem to be working.
There's another problem here, and that is that this borderless world that we're talking about and have done so much to create, and that Fred has described quite rightly, has sparked a backlash. You know, for the globalizers like us, and you know, probably in this room, you know, globalization spells opportunity. For many others, the borderlessness of globalization represents a threat. You know, it's somebody coming to eat your lunch. It's somebody coming from another country freely across a border in order to take your job. Now, this is sparking a cultural and an identity political backlash and maelstrom, which we have got to address as intelligently and sensitively as we have done the economic and social policy aspects. You know, the issues of identity are not simply going to be addressed by fairer distribution. That, in my view, is a necessary but insufficient condition for dealing with these wider cultural issues. And we in the mainstream of politics, I'm afraid, are failing to understand, to come to terms and to address these issues in the way that we need to.
Fred Smith, do you want to come back on some of the points that Ailish and...
Well, I completely agree that there have been a lot of people left behind because of globalization, and the key is to provide a pathway for those people to get employment. But in the United States, that is happening at a very rapid clip, but not at the governmental level the way Europe has done it. In our state of Tennessee, we're the first state in the union to make community college free. So we've, in essence, gone from 12 years public education to 14 to allow this kind of skills training that's going to be required for the jobs of the future. Secondly, we as a corporation are putting millions of dollars into training aircraft maintenance technicians. We're even now providing scholarships for people to become pilots because the military is not going to produce them. So if you have a high growth rate, if you've got good fiscal and tax policies in an advanced society, I'm not sure that the solution is at the governmental level, and I'd argue that Europe's a pretty good argument against it, because Europe's growth rates now are so low because of the sclerotic nature of some of these policies. We'll see, but I'd be interested in what you're doing at MasterCard, but we're putting millions of dollars into retraining people and trying to get the workers of the future.
And have you found ways to compensate the losers from trade, things that work?
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say at the beginning. I think the world's changing very quickly. In fact, we're talking about trade, but technology. Look at what AI and robotics will do to jobs. Look at what driverless vehicles will do to the nature of work. I'm not saying you should be scared of that technology. I think you should embrace it because of all the good things it brings. But we've got to figure out it's going to impact our societies. And so all of us, politicians, trade negotiators, CEOs, and others, you've got to work to the idea that we've got to put our shoulder to the wheel through our own methods. I'm a little where Fred is, that I think government's role should be to help provide broad guidelines and principles and the right supportive environment. But CEOs and companies need to step up and make a difference because it's in our own self-interest. The reason he's doing that aspect about training pilots is not because he suddenly woke up in the morning and got hit by an epiphany that his future depends on, recruiting and training 3 more pilots. It's because without them, FedEx cannot fly. And so making doing well and doing good become a part of your natural cultural system because it's in your own self-interest is the best way to get corporate technology, investment dollars, and business models working on what I consider to be big problems that are way too big for government funding to solve. The problem with the European system is government funding runs dry when social welfare and healthcare need to be funded by one source. It becomes a high tax, high payout system. It creates inefficiencies. It creates what is called leakage in the NGO world, which I call theft. And the best way to get out of all that is to allow government to play its natural role, create the guidelines, create the space, allow private entrepreneurship to go at it full tilt because it's in our self-interest. That combination is the combination that I'm a believer in. And that's what we're doing. That's what Fred's talking about. So that's what I'm getting to. I think remaking global trades is an interesting topic, but actually it's about remaking where our society is going because of trade and technology. And that's a freight train that's coming our way. It's not a light at the end of the tunnel. It's a train coming our way.
I agree so much with that. But if we're going to remake global trade, we don't just have to remake the sort of political consensus that underpins it, we have to remake the institution that runs it, the WTO.
Absolutely.
Let's be absolutely clear amongst us that the WTO has almost become too big to avoid failing. And I don't just mean too big in size, I mean it is struggling very, very hard indeed to accommodate the different interests reflected in the different sizes of economy, levels of development and openness of those economies, but also the different sorts of economy that you now see represented in the WTO, on a spectrum from the very market-based to the very state-backed and led. And this is the big challenge for the WTO. It's to remake not just its ethos, but above all, to start rebuilding its rule book to reflect that very, very different pattern and large-scale membership that it has within it.
Right, we are going to run out of time, but I think we should have a final last word, because I think one thing that Donald Trump has achieved, I think, is to demonstrate to everybody who has a stake in this system that if we don't do this better, the pie could well shrink. We're already seeing losses that are unnecessary losses, and we can say irrational losses from trade wars and from this language. But it will continue if we don't manage to get through some of these challenges. So if we want to be in a better place in 5 or 10 years' time on trade and not on what feels like quite a negative trajectory now, quickly from each of you, what is the one thing that puts us in a better place that is not just business as usual?
I think engagement on this entire policy debate on reforming the WTO, those of us who sit outside and let somebody else discuss it, we will all be losers. Got to engage in that while doing well and doing good in your company at the same time. I just believe without that, you don't deserve to be in the kind of jobs that we are lucky enough to be in.
Okay. Fred.
Try to move to a zero tariff, zero subsidies, zero non-tariff barrier world. That's the proven formula for success. Everything that at the political level that works against that is a net drag. And so I don't think you can argue with the history of the positives from trying to make that the ideal. And it should be enforced, obviously, by some sort of multilateral organization like the WTO.
Yeah, I think that each of us, can't be complacent. And certainly, I'll say there's one other fire that's been lit here, and that is real questions around reciprocity. And we should just start having really honest conversations about what it's going to take. I think the WTO, in terms of governance, has brought us as far as it can. It's too important to fail. So what are we going to do about alternative dispute settlement? Engaging, like Canada has, in plurilateral agreements where we can do them. And that last piece of having conversations about the behind-the-borders issues, frankly, around competition and subsidies that are some of the leftover issues. And like I said, I know that there's a way forward together.
I congratulate Canada for taking the initiative at the end of October with the EU and Japan. About 13 reform-minded nations in the WTO met to talk about how the WTO can be repaired. But that overhaul of the WTO will not happen, it will not succeed without China completely committing to it. The reason why China poses such a huge challenge to the international trade system is partly, obviously, because of the size of its economy. It's like a juggernaut almost running out of control in the international trading system. But the scale and penetration of its industrial policies, the issues to do with intellectual property protection, the issue of subsidies, I'm not condemning China for pursuing these policies. All I'm saying is that to enable the international trading system and the WTO and its rules to come to terms with and accommodate such a state-led economy of the sort that we're seeing in China, China has to do very, very much more than it is in taking the initiative and exercising that responsibility and stepping up to the plate in helping everyone else lead a reform process in the WTO. If we don't see China doing that, then you're going to see more and more Trumpian rhetoric and disaster.
Lord Mandelson, Commissioner Campbell, Fred Smith, Ajay Banga, thank you very much.
Thank you.